The first asset we're going to build for our library is going to be a lamppost. But before I begin modeling, I need to do a little bit of scene setup, namely establishing a scale. Now, if we imagine that our default cube here is a building, it's kind of an ideal size based on the grid floor. But first, anytime we're dealing with the default cube, if I want to raise it to sit flat on the grid floor, I'm going to tab into edit mode, make sure everything is selected, and hit G, Z, and 1 on the number pad. All right, that will essentially move all my verts up 1 grid unit, which sets it flat on the ground floor. Now it's a little bit easier to imagine this as a building. And since all of our assets are going to be modular, especially our buildings and our street sections need to fit a scale and a modular unit size in order to easily snap together and be assembled, kind of like a system of Legos. And by default, our snapping in Blender is set to incremental or the grid. And if I hit G, Shift Z to limit our movement laterally, no vertical movement, and then hold Control to enable snapping, you can see that our cube is snapping to the grid very, very cleanly. And we want to conform to this for our project. So I don't care about real world scale. This would be a very small building in that context. But for our library, that doesn't matter at all. Now from rehearsal, I know that I want to turn this into a human size reference. And I know that the value, if we open up our in panel view properties and go to our scale, if I set all of these, click and drag to get all the values 0.2, that's going to be a good human height for the buildings to come. And I want to establish a human reference because our lamppost needs to make sense relative to a human size. Now to make this more obvious as a human stand-in, I'm going to go back to our X and Y scale values and make those 0.05. So now it's a tall, skinny cube instead. I'm going to rename this to human, or let's say ref underscore human. And I'm going to delete our camera and light. We do not need those. And we'll rename this collection REF for reference. I'll select my scene collection, add a new collection, and we'll call this assets, and then add another collection and call this Standalone, which will contain our lamppost. So I can move our human ref off to the side, and actually that's a convenient shape to begin modeling our lamppost. So let's duplicate that with Shift D, right click, and then Alt G to clear transformational data, which positions it back at the center of our world. And then I can rename this as lamppost and throw that in the Standalone collection. Just click and drag to move collections. All right, now we can begin modeling the lamppost. And while we could probably create a decent lamppost without looking at reference, I always recommend at least glancing at reference over not looking at reference. So let's quickly take a mental snapshot of a reference photo. I like to use Unsplash. It's my favorite place for public domain images. And I can search lamppost. And we're going to get a variety which we can choose. While I personally like the curved kind of shepherd staff look, I don't think the curve benefits the cube theme we're going for. So I'm going to go with a straight up and down lamppost like this one, but I want to see all of the lampposts for my mental snapshot. Actually, this silhouette is pretty good, but it is a little too curved. And I think that there's a good one a little bit below. Let's see. Yeah, this one actually. So if we maximize that, this is the kind of lamppost I want to create both in silhouette and that cubish lamp at the top. And so take a mental snapshot of our silhouette. We have a wide base that tapers slightly into like a first section, and then it extends upward into a skinny pole with the lamp on top. All right, so pretty standard lamppost, easy enough to remember, and we should get along fine modeling that. So I'm going to first apply our scales, because right now our scale is skewed, and Blender kind of sees the transforms of an object as its own sort of contained world where the tools will behave according to the rules of that world. So for example, if I tab into edit mode with everything selected and hit Control B, that is the bevel tool, and you'll see that our bevel is not evenly sized along the edges. It's being skewed according to that scale. So undo, let's go back to object mode by hitting tab, and I want to apply the scale. Control A and apply the scale. Nothing happens visually, but you can see that our X and Y scale values are back to 1. It's essentially resetting our object scale. And now the tools should behave like we expect. Control B, bevel. Now they're all evenly beveled edges. But generally you want to apply the scale before beginning to model. You'll just notice your tools kind of acting funny. And in more advanced situations, you might want to leave the scale skewed. But again, that's advanced situations. This is very simple. I'm going to switch to face selection mode by hitting the 3 key on our number row, and I can move that down with GZ. Also, I should say that I prefer not to use the widget, or it looks like they're called gizmos. All right, so these move, scale, and rotate. I can't remember. I think they're on by default, but I always turn them off. I think it's just much cleaner to not have this obstruction covering up my model, to just use hotkeys. So I will turn off widgets completely, actually, and use our GZ to move down in Z, and we'll make the bottom of our base. And then the I key is inset. I'm going to bring that in a little bit and then up to represent that first section of the light post. And actually, I think I need a new edge, so I'll hit Control R and then bring that down with G and Z. All right, so now we've got kind of the base of the pedestal with a slight taper in this first section. And then I'm going to E to extrude a little bit up, and then hit Z to make sure it sticks to the vertical axis only. And let's also Control R to cut a new edge of similar distance to that top one. And then in face select mode, Alt click to select this face loop. Same thing at the bottom, Shift Alt click. Shift adds to the selection. And then I can hit I to inset these faces just a little bit, and then Alt S will push those faces out. Now we have this decorative little extrusion. And then we're ready for our tall, skinny section. So maybe I'll scale that top face in just a little bit, E and Z. Actually, that always confuses me. Let's undo that. So I think extrude by default will push it along the normal. And in this case, it is straight up. You can see that blue axis. But sometimes I'll just hit Z twice to make sure that it's the global Z axis rather than the normal. But I'm probably getting into some weeds of modeling we don't need to worry about right now. Let's see. I want to undo that. I undid the scaling in a little bit. Okay. E. I'll just leave it E by itself, and that goes straight up. We'll scale it down a little bit. So now we have that nice taper in the longer section. All right, we will E to extrude up one more time to create a decorative bevel. Maybe make that a little bit higher. And actually, maybe add another one here. I seem to remember something like that from the reference photo. Alt click to select that face loop. I to insets, and basically scale down an interior set of faces. Alt S to push those out. Excellent. All right, now we just have the lantern portion. I'm going to go into front orthographic. I'm going to I inset a little bit, E to push it upwards, extrude it upwards, I mean, and then E right click essentially extrudes a new set of faces but doesn't transform them, and I just want to scale them out instead like this. And then E to extrude again up, S to scale out, creates the top of our lamp, maybe a little bit bigger. E to extrude again, right click, S to scale outward, E extrude straight up in Z, and then in perspective view, I'm going to hit the period key to zoom in on our selection, and I to inset, E to extrude up just a little bit, S to scale in. Okay. That is the essential silhouette we're looking for out of our lamppost. And then I'm going to go to face selection mode. I'm going to select all these faces around this loop. So Alt, left click. And now I'm going to I to inset, but I want to change one of the parameters of the tool. So anytime you perform an operation, the options appear in the bottom left. So I want to expand those and choose the individual option towards the bottom. All right, this will treat all the faces individually, which gives us an even bevel around them. And then I'm going to inset one more time, just a little bit, Alt S to push inward this time. And now we've got some windows for our lamp light to shine out of. And I think that's going to work very well. Now, how does the scale feel? You know, we don't have to be crazy about the scale, just as long as it's close. And I think that that's going to work out. It can always be adjusted a little bit later, but you know, I think this is going to work fine. All right, so we do not need our human ref anymore. We've created our model. Are there any other questions? Oh, one thing, you might be wondering, how much detail do we model? If we go back to look at our reference, you know, there's all kinds of details, decorative, and several more little, you know, extrusion rings to break up the silhouette. Do we model those or not? Clearly, I have omitted them because keep in mind that we are most likely going to be rendering this from far away, right? Our asset library is designed to build these fun cityscapes. And so a lamppost is going to be very small in such a cityscape. And so we don't want to spend unnecessary time modeling details that won't really be seen. Arguably, some of these details already won't be seen. But, you know, it's possible that I'll render an angle at a street level. So this looks fine at a street level. That's kind of how I'm gauging how much detail to put into these things. Also, the theme is simplicity, cubish in nature. So this should work great. Now that's going to be it for the modeling. In the next lesson, we will add our materials. Now let's create materials for our lamppost. I'm going to switch to the shading workspace. And, you know, really we don't need the file browser or the image editor because we're not going to be using image textures at all. We're going to be doing everything entirely procedurally. That's the most flexible and the easiest to manage, meaning we won't have a ton of image textures to wrangle. And, you know, the theme is simplicity, so we don't really need specific textures to paint. For the most part, solid colors and simple gradients will suffice. But I do want to reorder our windows a bit because we're dealing with an asset that's mostly tall. So I want to bring this over to be kind of small on the right side. And then I'm going to Control, left click and drag to flip the windows. I'm going to overtake our 3D viewport and then click and drag our shader window over the file browser. So now we've got a large shader editor and an appropriately proportioned 3D viewport. Okay, let's talk about how our materials are going to be structured. You know, we're thinking large in terms of a library. That means several materials to manage. How can we best assign them to our objects? Can we reuse materials? And yes, I do want to reuse materials as much as possible. So think of all the materials in our city in basic terms, like a painted material. This can apply to a car, to this lamppost, for example. Then you have an emissive material. This applies to the headlight of a car, or the light part of the lamppost, or the windows on a skyscraper or any building. All of the windows can use the same material. And that's how we can use the minimal amount of materials for the maximum effect. And we're going to begin creating materials with that in mind. So I'm going to rename this material Cubicity, giving it the project context, underscore painted. Now I actually need two materials. That's going to be the majority of our object, but then in the window part where the light shines through, that needs its own material. So in our slot, let's create a new slot and then create a new material, and that will be called Cubicity underscore, let's see, how about glass emit? All right, again, I think that this could work for headlights of a car. It could also work for these lamps. All right, so in the daytime, it's going to be simple glass, like white glass. So our base color is pretty close to white. Let's go ahead and make it 0.9. And then the specular, you know, 0.3, roughness 0.05. So it's very shiny. And that's really all we need to worry about. But even though we've created the slot and the material, we haven't assigned it anywhere. So I'm going to tab into edit mode on our object, and I conveniently already have the windows of our lamp selected. And in slot 2, I can click assign. All right, then I can hit Control I to invert. Oh, but I don't need to assign to the rest of the object. By default, in slot 1, that's assigned to everything else. All other slots after number 1 need explicit assignment. All right, so We've talked about how we want to reuse materials as much as possible throughout all of our objects, but we can't use a default base color. Like if I want my car paint to be blue, I don't want my lamppost to be blue or my fire hydrant to be blue. So instead, we're going to lean on vertex colors per object to be piped into the shared material. So we need to create a set of vertex colors. Now, this is 3.2 alpha, which changed the way color attributes are assigned to an object. It's a little more robust. However, I was rehearsing this course using 3.1, which had the old legacy style vertex colors. And so it's different in 3.2 because if we go to color attributes, which used to be vertex colors, and we hit the plus button, we get a bunch of different options for how to create different styles of color. I'm not going to go into this. That's not the point. I really just want to lean on that legacy style vertex colors. So instead of creating it manually like this, which by the way, to get to traditional vertex colors, you want to switch the domain unintuitively to face corner and data type to byte color. Also, the default name used to be COL. I'm going to escape that. Instead, if we just switch from object mode to vertex paint mode, it will do all of that automatically for us. And the only reason this matters is that I created a bunch of materials and a bunch of assets that eventually will be included into our library, but they depend on vertex colors like this. Because in the material, when we're ready to incorporate it there, hit Shift A and go to Input Vertex Colors COL. All right, and that name right there has to match our color attributes. So that's why I'm just essentially trying to emulate the old style of vertex colors. All right, with that explanation out of the way, if I plug this color into our base color now, I can assign colors per object according to its object data. All right, so I'm going to switch it to a dark color, hit X to swap our swatches. And I don't want it completely black, but just a very dark gray. And then Shift K is the hotkey to flood our object or our selection with color. Now we do have the option to mask by selection, that little button here, that toggle. And tabbing into edit mode, we have everything but the window selected. So Control I will invert that selection, tab back to vertex paint, and I will paint this with white, which it should already be by default, but for good measure, Shift K white. Now, we are in material preview, so we don't really see the effects unless it's incorporated into the material. So we have a couple options. If we go to solid view and then switch to like flat and color, then that will be pure vertex colors. Or you can preemptively incorporate vertex color attribute into the material, which we did for the painted, but we did not do for our glass material. So I'm going to copy this vertex color attribute and then paste it over here. And then we can go back to material preview, and we are set up to continue using this material for any object we have vertex colors enabled. Excellent. So a couple settings with the painted material. I want to take our specular down to like 0.1. It doesn't need to be that shiny. And also the roughness, I will take that down to 0.2, so it's a little clearer in the reflections, but that should be fine as a general painted material. And the only other thing I want to add is a gradient. This is another theme that's going to carry through all our materials. Rather than be solid colors, simply adding a gradient does a lot for appeal. So in our material editor, make sure I'm on the Cubicity painted material, Shift A, and let's add a texture, gradient texture. All right, then I'm going to immediately hit Control T, which I should say is only possible if you have Node Wrangler enabled in your add-on. So open your user preference, look for Wrangler. Definitely keep this enabled. I mean, I do this on probably all my tutorials, especially if I'm creating any materials, but it's a no-brainer add-on. Definitely enable that and just keep it enabled. All right, that will enable you to have some shortcuts like adding the mapping and texture coordinate node. Also Shift Control clicking on gradient texture will allow us to view it. It plugs it into this custom viewer node, so we just see that node's data. And as we look at the gradient texture, it might be hard to see what it's doing on this object. So let's go back to object mode and add a cube. and add this same material, Cubicity Painted. And you can see that by default, our gradient texture is a left to right or lateral gradient from black to white. And we can rotate this if we change the Y value in our mapping node. That's why I hit Control T. I needed that mapping node. So we can change the orientation of that texture so that it's vertically up and down, which is what I want for our asset. All right, and what this does is put a gradient from dark to light that we can then overlay on top of our main color. So we'll select that, add a color, mix RGB, and let's either use overlay or soft light. Let's start with soft light. They essentially do the same thing, but soft light's a little more subtle. And Shift Control click. Now it's a little bit hard to see with the background being such a dark color. It'll be more obvious when we have, you know, brightly colored buildings and stuff like that, but still want to carry through this theme to every material. Let's take, in the viewport shading options, our world opacity down to 0, and that's a little bit easier to see. And now if I mute the soft light add-on with the M key, as in Monday, you can see solid color, now a little bit of gradient. All right, it seems really subtle now, but it's an important theme that will carry through all our materials and be worth it. So with our gradient texture, I should also say that we're using the generated coordinates, which is useful because as long as we don't change any of our, let's see, it's in object data properties, texture space, as long as we don't mess with any of this and we keep it auto texture space, then that gradient using the generated coordinates should be the same vertically for any object that's applied to. All right, that matters if the gradient looks good on the lamppost, but when I add a building, all right, like this cube, let's say that's the size of a building, we add that material, the gradient is still from top to bottom, even though the scale is larger. And so the only other thing I want to show you on this first material to kind of, you know, envision a non-destructive, easily adjustable set of materials, I've said that for our glass emit material, all right, I want to go back to material preview. Well, actually, I want to go back to Shift Control clicking the principal BSDF so we see our final painted material, then go back to glass emit. So in the daytime, obviously the lamppost is off. It's not going to be emitting any light. However, imagine we've got a ton of lampposts with this material. We've got headlights for our cars with this material, even the windows for our buildings. All we have to do to turn all of them on is go to our emission setting of the principal BSDF. Let's change that to like a yellow color. Emission strength up to, let's say, 10. And then in our render settings, enable bloom. That's just going to make any material that's illuminating have a glow effect. And as simple as that, we can start to convert our scene to a nighttime scene. And that's very powerful to not have to do that to a bunch of materials. So that's why we want to reuse materials, keep it modular as much as possible. And then when I want to turn it off, I just change that emission color to black, and we're back to a lamppost that is turned off. Okay, so that is the first set of materials, first asset created for our library. Let's save this file, of course. So file save as, let's put it in the proper directory. I'm going to create a new folder. Let's call it Cubicity Assets. And in that folder, I'm going to name my file the same thing. Honestly, I expect as the project develops to possibly modify some of these file names because it does become very important in a library-centric project dealing with a lot of assets, dealing with an asset library officially through the asset browser. Our naming and file structure needs to be well kept. But for now, I think just one file, one blend file with all of our assets inside will be ideal for establishing that asset library. So Cubicity Assets, save as, and let's create more. How about we build a bench next, keeping with the theme of street level assets? Sounds good to me. Let's quickly hop over to Unsplash again and do a quick reference image search. Let's just type in bench and see what we get. Okay, so this is actually super simple, maybe a little too simple. And they're also kind of out in the country. I wonder if we should refine with City Bench. Okay, yeah, this looks, wait. I think this is going to be perfect. It's kind of cubish. It's very simplified, no curves. I think this will be great. Okay. Taking a mental snapshot. All right, it's in my brain. So we could, a simple thing, how do we start the new asset? Since this street post is already the right scale and we have our human, we might as well just duplicate this. If we start with a cube, it's going to be much bigger. So let's just stay in the right scale frame of mind and simply duplicate our lamppost. Shift D and then right click so it doesn't move position. I will rename this to bench. Also, I'm going to add a suffix, CG cookie, to the bench as well as the light post. The reason being is I've probably said multiple times in other videos leading up to this one that I want to open this asset library so that you, CG Cookie members, can contribute to it. And I think the way I'm going to do that is through an exercise at the end of the course where if they get approved, I incorporate them into the asset library. And so to bring them into this scene and incorporate them, we need to have the suffix of the creator. So that's why I'm going to go ahead and start that protocol now. All right, so let's hide the lamppost and begin working on the model. I'm going to switch to the modeling workspace. We'll zoom in and where do we start from? Really, it can be as simple as a single vertex. I'm going to start with this bottom almost complete cube and then Control I to invert and delete everything else. All right, then we can fill the top and I'm going to select everything, S, Shift Z, which will scale in everything except vertical. And I'm essentially creating one of the legs of the bench. And we're also going to be implementing a modifier, a mirror modifier. So I'm going to move that off to the side in the X-axis. And do we still have screencast keys? We do. Okay, there we go. It's almost like I needed to refresh it or something. We'll turn off our widgets. And what was I doing? Yeah, adding a mirror modifier. All right, so I moved the cube in edit mode off to the side. It leaves the origin right there, that orange dot, as the central point of the object, and that's what our mirror modifier uses. Okay, so it's mirroring across that central point to get the other side, which is ideal for a bench. Now, if I kind of move that up, that's the front leg. I can Control L to select the whole contiguous mesh island, Shift D, move it backward in Y to get the back leg. And then we can move that up. We've got the foundation of the chair starting. Let's see, we're gonna refine proportions as we go, but I'm sort of centralizing the bench over the origin, and we need to connect the bench. I'm gonna cut two edges with Control R on each side. Shift Alt click to select both the edge rings, S, Z, and 0 to align them vertically in Z. That is scaling to 0 in Z. And with them aligned, I can hit Control B to create an opportunity to bridge. E to extrude this face out. We'll delete this face, select that one again, and I'm going to snap to our vertices. Okay, so here's our snapping options, vertex, and we want to make sure project onto itself is enabled so that it snaps onto other components within this mesh. G, Y, Control, and snap. All right, now I need to delete this face, X faces. I went to wireframe by holding Z and moving my mouse to the left. All right, now these are not connected, but since they're in the same place in 3D space, if I hit A to select everything and then the M key for merge and choose by distance, that will merge those. And that works because they're so close, they're actually exactly in the same space that tool just goes ahead and merges them. Now, back to face selection mode. All right, we'll select both of these faces, E and X. And, we crossed over the horizon of symmetry, as you can see. But if we enable clipping in our mirror modifier, then it will stop at the horizon of symmetry, X to remove faces. The reason I'm removing these faces is this is non-manifold geometry. It's basically error geometry. So you can't have a face within connected verts. That's just problematic. So we remove the interior, and now it's just a clean mirrored mesh. All right, so we've got the structure of the bench. Now we need to create the boards where the seat and the back. So I'm going to start this by selecting 4 verts that I can Shift-D duplicate and then right-click and then hit F, which is to fill those 4 selected verts into a face. And now I can kind of scale in Y and then extrude up, E, Z, and G, Y. I'm just going to move this to the back of the bench. There we go. Okay, so now that we've got these faces, we can easily cut boards. But let me select the whole thing, the whole seat and back, and then Shift-H, which will hide everything that is not selected. And then I can cut some boards or some edges that will become boards. And I think I just want 2 on the bottom and 2 on the back. And then I'm going to select each of those edges, Control-B, to bevel a little gap that I can delete those faces. I kind of need to bevel, whoops, not Control-V, I meant Control-B. Create a gap there too. Okay, cool. Alt-H to bring everything back, and Control-I to invert our selection back to the boards. When you unhide everything that was selected, it selects what was hidden, so just keep that in mind. Now I can E to extrude, right-click, Alt-S to push that extruded geometry out for thickness. And the only thing I don't like is that in the back they're connected. So I'm going to hover over the seat boards, L, 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 G, Y, and create a gap in the back. Okay, cool. Now, should I bring these out horizontally? GX. Yeah, I think that kind of makes sense to do on the seat. Okay. Then I'm going to create an armrest board. So Shift-D to duplicate this upper face. We will scale in X and then scale in Y a little bit. Move that back edge in Y, just like that. Control-L to select the contiguous mesh island, E, Z, and move that up, roughly matching the thickness of our other boards. And that is a bench. Maybe the seat is a little bit too wide. So let's see here. To do this cleanly without skewing anything, I'm going to do it first with the frame. All right, I'm going to select the frame structure of our bench, deselect the back, move it forward. So I'm shrinking the front to back depth. Control-L, let's just select everything and kind of recenter it over our origin. And then for the boards, I'm going to select each of them, and I want to scale back according to this vertex. All right, so the active vertex is highlighted in white, and we can use that to our advantage by making the pivot point the active element. And then when I hit S and Y, we're scaling all of these relatively according to that vertex as the pivot point. All right, so that kind of keeps everything even as we bring the seat depth back a little bit. All right, that's a bench. Simple enough. All right, and I think that matches roughly the size. If we can imagine the center being the waist, and where the seat is at is kind of the knee of our human reference. I think that's going to work fine. And let's add some materials. We'll go back to the shading workspace. And since we duplicated from our lamppost, it already has the cubicity painted material as well as the glass emission, which we do not need. In fact, I don't think we're going to need any other materials except the painted. The board, the white part that you see now is going to be wood, but I think we can get away with it using painted material qualities. So we don't have to create a dedicated wood material, at least not yet. Okay, so let's remove the glass emission. Now everything's using the Cubicity painted material. We need to establish some vertex colors. So we'll select it, tab into edit mode. We'll select all of our boards, and we should still have a vertex color from duplicating the lamppost object. So we can jump into vertex paint, and let's choose a wood color, a brown, you know, kind of in the orange zone, a little close to the center, kind of in between the center of the circle and the border. Something like that. Shift K to paint that. Okay, so we painted the whole thing because we did not use paint masking. That's fine. You know, we can paint the whole thing first, but next when we tab into edit mode, Control I to invert the selection, go back to vertex paint by hitting the tab key. And I think I realized that screencast keys needs to be disabled and then re-enabled each time I switch through a workspace. That is, that's annoying. Probably going to forget that a few times, so apologize for that. But back to vertex paint, we'll enable face masking, and then I'm going to swap our color swatches and choose kind of a darker sage green color. It's pretty typical of benches like this. And I think that's going to work fine. Let's see it next to our lamppost. Maybe it's a little bit light on the colors. Let's go back to vertex paint and darken the green. Shift K. Control I to invert our selection and darken the brown as well. X to switch our color swatch, and Shift K. Back to object mode. All right, I think that's a little bit better. Excellent. Scale looks good. And that's another asset complete. On to the next. So we've done two kind of man-made street level assets so far with the lamppost and the bench. But what about a street level organic asset like a tree? That could be an interesting challenge given our themes of simplicity and cubishness. I think I have a good idea about how we can handle that. But, you know, keeping with this glancing at reference, let's see what Unsplash gives us for, let's see, city tree, or what about sidewalk tree? Sometimes the art of efficient searching is just knowing which terms will lead you the right way quicker. And let's see if this is a good one. Okay, so this tree on the sidewalk, you know, I guess I'm really curious about less so what the tree looks like. I mean, trees are trees, but like how is it incorporated into the sidewalk is more what I'm curious about. So, oh wait, actually I think this is what I can use. Kind of giving it a small bed of dirt or mulch, kind of brown stuff, and a border of concrete maybe. You know, we don't need this beautifully random, you know, handmade brick looking stone whatever border, but just a simple concrete border, dirt, and then the tree grows out of it, and that can sit on top of the sidewalk. I think that's going to work for our cubicity theme. Once again, let's just start from an already scale relevant asset. Let's just duplicate the lamppost, Shift D, and let's name it appropriately. I'm also going to need to make some more room. We're going to have a lot of assets, so we're going to need to be able to read our outliner clearly. Let's call it tree. And maybe it should be a small tree. Maybe I'll need to make a bigger one as well. Let's try tree dash small underscore CG cookie. All right, so we can hide our others, and same kind of thing. We'll start, I think I'll actually sort of, let's see, we'll go to solid view, and I don't need to see our color information. Let's just go to studio and material, kind of resetting. So we get back to our gray modeling viewport. Oh, we're not even in the, that's what I should have done. Okay, I should revert this. Go back to color, go back to flat, or studio is fine. But I'm in the shading workspace. I still need to train myself to just switch workspaces. I typically default to modifying my existing workspace, but if we go back to modeling, we go to that gray kind of modeling centric viewport display. All right, so we're back here, and I think I'm gonna keep kind of the post up here as the tree trunk because it's, you know, a decent scale and we already are off to a good start. I am going to kind of slightly curve the trunk. So let's see, I'm going to select all of these edges and Control X. That did not work at all. I thought that would have worked. So Control X dissolves these edge loops. I guess you just can't. Oh, wait, I know why. I need to Shift Control Alt click to dissolve the edge rings. All right, so real quick, anatomy of a model. These are edge loops, okay? So like from vert to vert, they connect in a loop. But an edge ring is this, all right? Edges that kind of connect faces in a face loop. That's the difference there. So if I, essentially I can select this whole thing, but deselect the edge rings, and that's what will enable me to Control X, dissolve all of those in one fell swoop. You know, it probably would be a lot quicker just to delete these verts and simply, you know, bridge these, which we can do with loop tools. Just giving you a bunch of options for simple tasks. In preferences, it comes with Blender. It's an add-on that comes with Blender called Loop Tools. I recommend you enable that. And then in the viewport, when in edit mode, right-click Loop Tools and Bridge. All right, so since these are compatible, right? It's border edges, 4 vert border edge, 4 vert border edge, and Loop Tools Bridge. Okay. Anyway, if I didn't explain all that, it would have been quicker just to bridge in the first place, I think. All right, so I am trying to taper this. The trunk is already probably a little too, you can't dissolve verts, by the way. You need to do that in edge mode for that to work. All right, so let's shrink the taper. The trunk of the tree doesn't need to be quite that big. But yeah, just a smooth, oh, you know what? We got a little bit crooked. We got a little bit crooked because I've been using the active element and not median point. Okay, well, this is kind of a silly start to this video, but it's only been a few minutes. So let's just start simple. All right, we're just extruding a large trunk up and then cut a few new edge loops, Alt S, and push those inward. That is a very simple way to create a subtle taper. Wow, that was a funny way to get there. All right, now I'm going to select the bottom face, Shift D to duplicate and scale out. This creates our little bed of mulch. So E to extrude up. First, this is going to be the border. All right, so this is our concrete border. I to inset, E to extrude down in Z, and then I to inset. We're going to go really close to the trunk, push that up a little bit just to give it kind of a mound of mulch kind of feel. Maybe cut one more edge loop, make it a little bit more round, even though, again, we are not ever going to be that close to the tree, but I think that's going to work out pretty well. Now let me compare it to the lamppost and the human just to see how big our tree trunk is. I feel like actually the bed of our tree is too large because I mean, that's almost as large as the sidewalk would be. So let's hide the lamppost. Yeah, that needs to be smaller. Actually, the whole tree might need to be smaller. Let's select everything, S, Shift Z. We're scaling every direction except up and down. All right, that's going to be a little bit better. Okay. All right, so we've got our trunk. Now for the more interesting part, the leaves. How do we, you know, emulate this kind of tree leaf effect with only cubes? Well, it's actually just that. It's just going to be a bunch of cubes. So let's Shift A. Now, I am doing this in a separate object. I think that's just going to be a little bit cleaner. So far, I've been doing everything in the same mesh object with the lamppost and the bench, but we can keep them separate objects. And sometimes that's very helpful whenever you're building assets. Here, it's kind of potato, but I am going to keep them separate. So now this means we need to name them properly and add them to a collection. This is fine to get started this way. It's going to be a thing going forward as we create assets. It's going to be important, like put them into the asset library. So let's just create a new collection and copy that tree small CG cookie to the collection name. All right, and now within that, we've got tree small trunk. Put that in the collection. And then select our collection and add a new cube, mesh cube. All right, this we can just scale, and literally all I'm going to do is kind of start with a bigger cube, a few bigger cubes, and I want to be certain to rotate them randomly. I don't want them, facing the cardinal directions. So I'm going to duplicate. I'm going to rotate them. Oh, I'm hitting R twice to go into like tumble mode rotate or orbit mode rotate. If I hit R once, it's just rotating from the camera view as the axis. But if I hit R twice, we go into this tumble mode, which is perfect for this kind of thing. Let's offset the scale a little bit. Shift D, duplicate again, tumble rotate. And we've got a start to this cubish tree leaf cluster. All right, and so we've got 3 big cubes. Now I'm going to duplicate and we're going to go to a smaller layer. Same process of rotating the cubes in like tumble mode, slightly change the scale, and I'm just kind of intersecting our original 3 cubes. And I'm just going to build this up into a clump. And then there's going to be maybe one more layer of smaller cubes outside of these. All right, I didn't really change the rotation on that. After you get a few of them, maybe you can select multiple and Shift D to duplicate a lot. Move them around. That can kind of expedite this process. Make sure you don't have a cube that's barely, sticking out of the intersection. That's just kind of a waste. But now we're starting to get somewhere. And, keep in mind the overall silhouette, because we don't want to lose the kind of ball-shaped cluster. I kind of see that my silhouette is favoring this side now. So, I want to even that out, basically. Yeah, look at this guy just kind of off on its own. Some of that can be okay, but overall, we've got this really plain square, without any level 2 cubes. And this is kind of fun, if I'm honest, because it's very freeform, not a lot of pressure. That's what I like about the theme of this project in general, is keeping it simple and freeform is very fun. All right, let's do the last layer. I think this looks pretty good. Shift D, duplicate, scale down. And I'm definitely going to try and expedite this with selecting multiple once I have a few established. I don't want to go too small. I don't want to go to a level like this. That's just a little too granular. So I think 3 levels is going to be great. All right, now that I've got 3, let's duplicate these around. Make sure that none of them are, disconnected and not touching any of the other cubes. We want to make sure they're touching, but loosely populated around. And as I duplicate a little small group of them, choosing random groups to duplicate will help with the randomization. This kind of thing, it's like an art to randomizing in a appealing, efficient way. I think I might have a few too many small cubes. I don't want it to look like sprinkles on a dollop of ice cream. That's not what I'm going for. It's, the silhouette is actually a little too round right now. I want it to be bulbous, but I also want it to have a breakup in the silhouette. So maybe I just went a few too many of these small ones. Yeah, I think that was the problem. So maybe just adjusting the scale here and there. It helps, I think, to kind of push the point of the cube out towards the edge. If I undo that, the face of the cube is pointed out. But I like it when the point is facing out. But at this point, you probably get the idea. It's just a matter of executing it. You know, what might help is looking at the gray. It gets hard to look at, like hard to really understand what we're doing. So we can, if we just go to rendered view, no, not what I wanted. Oh, that's what we can do. We can go to use scene lights and scene world. Let's just copy the material. There we go. Basically, I just want to see a silhouette. And then as we orbit around there, so what did I just do? The viewport shader in material preview mode generally, by default, has scene lights and scene world disabled, which allows us to use the HDRI here. But in rendered view, those are typically turned off. Or there isn't the HDRI enabled, but it's the scene lights and scene world. Since we don't have a world and since we don't have scene lights, it just lights up black. Or lights up. It just is not illuminated, and that's why we get a black silhouette. So we can hide our human ref and kind of orbit around, and the silhouette does look pretty good. I think the tree trunk's a bit thin, so select that whole thing, S, Shift Z, so we scale out at the trunk. All right, I think that looks pretty good. Another thing to keep in mind about our duplication is we want to hit this sweet spot where we can use this as a modular asset and duplicate it around several times, but we don't want it to be noticeable as a duplicate. And so if the canopy of the tree, if the leaves were too symmetrical all the way around, it would be too bland and it wouldn't look like variety. But if it's too extreme, right? If the silhouette is like this, you know, we got this chunk of leaves way out there, then that's going to be noticeable whenever it's duplicated. So you want to kind of split the difference and have just enough variety while also being not too noticeable to be able to duplicate them around and that not being as noticeable, and not be an eyesore, because obvious duplication is a poor quality CG telltale sign. And also, it's something to keep in mind is we will be implementing some material randomization eventually that will also help with, you know, as I duplicate a tree, the green leaves will be slightly different. We will implement that eventually. But for now, I'm happy with the tree. Let's go back to solid view. And I think this is going to work pretty well as a cube themed tree. Okay, cool. For the materials, let's jump into our shading workspace. And we are going to need a few different materials here. We're going to need concrete, which we haven't created yet. We're going to need some sort of dirt material. We're going to need, well, wood. And I kind of avoided the wood in the bench lesson, but now that's two assets that need wood. I might as well create a dedicated wood material and a leaf material. So all new materials, actually. Okay, so what I can do is actually duplicate any of the cubicity materials. Let's start with painted. And we'll duplicate this. Yeah, with that button right there, the kind of, it looks like the copy paste button. And we'll call this cubicity concrete. Oh, I wonder if I could use concrete for the wood, because material wise, they have similar specular levels. I might do that. Again, I'm thinking of how to minimize the effort. If I don't need a wood material and can get away with using a concrete material for that, I might as well save the extra material. Cubicity concrete, and let's just apply this to the whole thing for now. I can just remove slot 2. Okay, let's take our cubes also and just combine them into one mesh. So in object mode, select all our leaf cubes, Control L, I'm sorry, not Control L, Control J to make it one object, and we'll call it, we'll copy the name from here, and we'll call it tree trunk, tree small leaves. Actually, I might just call it tree leaves. If I create a bigger tree, I'll use the same leaf cluster and just scale it up a little bit. At least that's the idea for now. So tree leaves, CG cookie, excellent. This needs its own material. Okay, yeah, okay, I'll come back to the leaves. For our concrete, Basically, we need a low specular and a fairly high roughness, like 0.4. Actually, before I mess with any of the material settings, I should really create some vertex groups so we're not looking at a black tree. All right, so with our tree trunk, we should already have a color attribute. Perfect. Let's select that trunk. We'll jump over to vertex paint and Shift K to paint it brown. Then we'll select the base and we'll paint that gray. Vertex paint. We'll paint it gray, basically just reducing the saturation completely. And yeah, something like that. Like a mid-level gray. Shift K. Whoops, I need to enable selection masking. Shift K, and then select the interior. We can select that central vertex loop. Control plus will grow your selection, and it should be everything. Okay, cool. And we can assign in vertex paint another brown, and we'll make it a little bit darker. Shift K. All right, so we've got the base colors established, the trunk colors. Let's go to our tree leaves, and we need to add, let's see, color attributes. All right, so we'll just jump into vertex paint. It'll add that color attribute automatically. We'll switch to a nice bright greenish yellow color. Shift K. There we go. That should work out fine for now. And then we'll adjust the material properties. You know, I think for the leaves, I think for most of this, I could actually use concrete, except for the dirt. The dirt is going to need a special bump. Also, I don't love that the dirt has these hard edges. So let's, while we're thinking about it, select this object and let's see if we right click and choose shade smooth. All right, that's going to attempt to turn the whole shading smooth. It's, you know, just a trick that the computer can do through these things called normals. But in your object data, if you go to the normals, you can enable auto smooth. And this gives us a threshold of an angle that if the face angle, like the edge angle, if it's below this threshold, it smooths out. Let me see if that's true. So the closer I go to a high level, yeah, because these are 90-degree angles, and as I go above 90, boom, you see that? As I go above 90, they get smooth. So below a threshold of 30, which is the default, and that's usually a pretty good value, that dirt is going to smooth out, basically. Okay, so that's a little more appealing, not so faceted. All right, where were we at? Okay, so let's focus on our concrete material that we are using for, let's see, maybe, okay, I think I'll use the painted material for the tree leaves. Maybe I should just create a dedicated leaf material. Let's focus on this. I'm kind of scatterbrained. Make sure we're in material preview. Okay, so for concrete, really the biggest difference is I want to add a texture, noise texture, because this will allow us, if I shift control click on this, it's this beautiful cloud randomness pattern. And if we plug that into our roughness, it's going to break up the specular, which is really handy. I'm going to use the object texture coordinates into the noise vector. And let's see, I immediately want to increase the detail from 2 to 10. That's going to just give it a finer frequency of detail. The roughness maybe go up to 0.6 from 0.5, and then like 0.2 in the distortion value. Also, we're going to add a converter color ramp, which allows us to kind of play with the levels. If I bring up the black flag, it increases the contrast, and same with the white flag. Okay, so something like this. Now, if we just plug this straight into roughness, let's see what it looks like before and after. Let it compile first. So you can sort of see that the specularity is broken up. All right, I want to see it on the, what if we switch our HDRI? There we go. You can kind of see it broken up. And I want it to be subtle, but I do like that we're getting a little bit of a variety. Now, I think my values are too extreme, so let's go to, let's say instead of black, we'll go to like 0.1, and instead of white, we'll go to like 0.5. All right, that's a lot more subtle, just a little bit of breakup. Sometimes that goes a long way, even with a simple project, because it just adds a little bit of extra texture and dimension to our materials. All right, our specular, I think, is maybe too much. Let's go to 0.05. We don't want our tree trunk to really be shiny, so maybe that means actually our color ramp, the higher we go up in roughness, the more dull the reflections. So maybe I should take our upper flag value to like 0.8. That's maybe too much, 0.7. And maybe the lower flag is the problem. Let's go to like 0.2. All right, that's looking a little more concrete-ish and tree trunk-like. That's going to be good. Can this just use the concrete too is a question I have. Another thing that's missing from our EV render setup is ambient occlusion. That's kind of a typical thing you want to create. You want that effect present. Oh, there we go. Render engine. EV, ambient occlusion. I mean, that might look okay too, with the leaves having this kind of breakup of the specularity. What would I do if it were its own material? I think I'm just going to leave it. I think it's fine. Let's take a look. You know, we've had that gradient texture implemented this whole time. So if we turn it off and then on, I just want to remind us the use of that gradient. All right, off and on. You see how it gets darker, whoops, at the base and then a little bit brighter at the top. I really, really like that effect. The tree leaves might need to be a little bit darker. Let's go to vertex paint, bring that value down a bit. Maybe increase saturation, Shift K. Ooh, I like that. Ooh, yeah. I think that's going to be nice. Though I'm not sure I like the breakup anymore. What if we just switch to the painted? I mean, tree, they're not really shiny either. For some reason, I'm just really avoiding creating a dedicated tree leaf material. But let's just bite the bullet and do it. I don't want to manage a ton of materials, basically. So the fewer I can use, the better. Cubicity, tree leaves. But we're giving it its own material. That's fine. And it's based off the paint material, which doesn't have any specular breakup. I'm fine with that. But I need to take the specular roughness up a little bit to 0.3 and the specular value down to like 0.05. All right, so it just has a little bit of reflection, enough to not be, you know, like paper. All right, I think we're good now. A little bit of breakup on the trunk, a little bit of breakup on the concrete. Oh, wait, we did forget the dirt material. So we will duplicate the, let's actually create a new slot first. Select our concrete material, duplicate that, and call it Cubicity Dirt. All right, and here what we're going to do is, again, we're going to use the noise texture, but we're going to break it up significantly. Well, I think I'll actually duplicate the noise texture. So select these two nodes, Shift Control D will duplicate and maintain our inputs. I'm going to hold Shift, right click and drag across them to create a reroute node, trying to make these as easily readable as possible. So that one input, you can see that they're using the same input. But for the second noise texture, I want to increase the scale to like, let's try 10. I'm going to also revert this node. So let's hit the delete button to revert it back to default settings. Shift Control click on that. Oh, okay, so I didn't assign the dirt to the dirt part of the mesh. So with that selected in edit mode, slot 2, assign Cubicity Dirt. Okay, now we're looking at this. This looks pretty good. I'm just increasing the contrast. Let's also take the roughness up to like 0.8. It's going to make it very granular. And then I'm going to use a vector node bump. Okay, so we're going to take this black and white value, plug into a bump map. And what the bump will do is take black values and treat them like they're bumped in. And then they'll treat the light values as if it's bumped out. And so whenever we plug this in to, oh, right, so it's a normal value, which is also bump. It's affecting the vector data of the surface. And that goes into our normal slot. And now we should see this bump effect in our dirt, kind of, making it just, well, bumpy. All right, that didn't seem to work at all. Oh, because our color ramp from the noise texture is plugged into the normal. We want it plugged into the height. All right, that determines, the height of the bump. Black being low height, white being high height. All right, so you see how that kind of creates a dirt-like effect? Yeah, that's going to be good. And I mean, frankly, are we ever going to see it that close? Maybe not. But even from far away, it's got this beautiful breakup. So that's going to work well for dirt. Maybe the strength is a little too high. Typically, it is too high out of the gate. Let's go to 0.5. Yeah, I think that's already going to be a little bit better. That looks good. That looks really good. All right. That is the third asset down. Tree is a big one. We want some color, some life on the streets, I guess. And it's organic. It's also cube. It fits the themes. I'm really happy with this. Cool. So that's 3 assets down. On to the next. So far we've built a few street level assets, but I want to migrate up to the rooftops because there's a lot of assets we can build to populate those. And for reference, let's jump back over to Unsplash, and I'm going to search NYC, New York City rooftops. That might have been the dumbest clarification I've ever made. Let's see what we get. And I maybe should also mention, all right, so I'm not really going for a Tokyo neon downtown Manhattan type of city where it's mostly skyscrapers. Instead, I want a mixture, a few skyscrapers, but mostly residential, kind of mid-level height buildings. And we'll go over this more once we get to building our buildings. But for now, I just want to focus on what's on rooftops. And actually, this image might be really good for getting an idea. Yeah, so from this angle, we can see a few major commonalities between buildings, things like water towers. Almost every building has one of those. HVAC units, skylights, looks like some plants, but also these roof access structures, essentially small buildings that have a door where a stairwell leads up to provide access to the roof. That's what we're going to build next. And though this one is a little bit more modern, I want to build one that's more relevant to like a brownstone type building, which also gives us a good reason to use a brick material. Let's see if there is anything specifically matching. Not really. So we're going to mostly make this up. Actually, this shape kind of matches it. It's going to be a simple square with a slanted roof and a door. Really simple. So let's get started. I think I will begin with our human ref. We don't need our tree visible, but we do want to see our human ref. Looks like I have a material on that. Let's get rid of that. Also, we'll switch back to the modeling workspace. And I think I changed the material, the matte cap. Let's go back to Studio. And I'm going to duplicate with Shift D and then Alt G. Okay, Alt G will clear the transforms of our translations. In other words, return our object origin back to the center of the world. And I'm just going to establish a believable scale. All right, so if this is the height of a person, our building's going to need to be higher than that. Something like this, and then a little bit wider. These structures don't usually seem to be very large, but about the size of a stairwell, maybe a little bit bigger. So I think I'll go a little bit wider and then also deeper, something like this. All right, I think that's going to work great for a roof access structure. Now I want to apply our scales because they are not set to 1, as we can see in the view properties. To apply them, we'll hit Control A. And our hotkeys, I need to refresh those real quick. Turning screencast keys off and then back on. Okay, so Control A to apply scale. All right, now let's cut an opening for a door. Let's start with an edge loop for the top. I think that's probably going to work good. And then Control R again and mouse wheel up so we cut 2 edges. and then right click so we don't slide those around, SX, and this will become our door. All right, so just ballparking the size or the width of a door. Let's select that face, E to extrude in, about like that. Now we do have a problem on the bottom. Two faces are on top of each other, but in our extrusion parameters, we can enable this dissolve orthogonal edges, and that will fix that for the most part, but it creates kind of another problem. So let's just delete all of that. And I suppose we can fill it. I mean, we could also leave it blank. Let's just leave it blank. Save a handful of polygons. All right, next I'm going to select the back row of edges on the top, and we're just going to give it a slight slant like this. Okay, from here, let's select our 4 corner verts, and I will duplicate with Shift D, right click, and then scale them up a little bit bigger, and then fill so we have a new polygon for our roof. Then I'll hit Shift H to hide everything else. And what I want to do is make this kind of like a corrugated sheet metal type roof. So Control R, and I'm going to mouse wheel up several times. I think 6, that should be fine. And then I'm going to double that number in our loop cut and slide parameters, 12. All right, the reason being I'm going to select every alternating edge, every other edge, and I'm going to move those up. All right, now we've got that corrugated type ridging. And then tab to object mode, that looks pretty good. I think I want to give some thickness to the roof. So I can do that very easily with a modifier. So I need to separate this into its own object. So back into edit mode and then Alt H to unhide everything. Hover over the roof and hit L to select the mesh island, and P will bring up our separate menu. And I'm going to choose separate by selection. This becomes its own object. I can tab to object mode, select the roof, and I need to rename these objects. Let's see, roof dash access underscore roof. And the other one is roof access underscore structure. All right, we also need to add it to a collection in Standalone, and we'll call it roof access underscore CG cookie. Okay, let's throw those objects in the correct collection. All right, back to our roof object, and we can add a modifier called solidify, and the default settings actually work pretty well. Just to give it a little bit of thickness, I might make it slightly thicker. There we go. I think that keeps it, you know, chunky and more in that cube theme. And that's it for the model. You know, I might bring it down a little bit so that no, I can't do that. I don't want the structure to be penetrating the roof. So that's fine, just like that. No one's really going to be looking at this from below. It's primarily going to be from above. All right, so that's it for the model. Now let's create materials. The star of this lesson is going to be the brick material, which is pretty easy to set up and a lot of fun. So we'll go back to our shading workspace. Let's select our structure. And, you know, I always want to start from an existing material because we have things set up in there like vertex colors and what's the other one? Oh, the gradient. So I'm going to select our cubicity concrete because that's most similar to a brick material. And I'm going to duplicate it with this button, and we're going to call it cubicity brick. And this material will get a lot of use because a lot of our buildings will use it. And first, let's establish some vertex colors. Now this object shouldn't have any. Yeah, no color attributes. So the best method is just to jump into vertex paint, and that will automatically use the COL attribute to fit with the material component that we've set up. And in vertex paint, let's choose a pretty standard kind of orangish brick, maybe a little bit darker, Shift K. And then let's select, I have my overlays turned off in this workspace. So we will select the face that is our door. And in vertex paint, let's make it that sage green. That's pretty standard for that kind of thing. Enable selection masking, Shift K, and then go back to our roof, vertex paint, and let's make this kind of a darker, almost maroon, something like that. Oh, this doesn't have a material, so let's go with that concrete. I wonder if that'll work. Yes, actually. Obviously, the roof is not going to be concrete, but in this context, it kind of works like a rusty roof that's been there a long time, which is more what I'm going for. So I think that will suffice quite well. Now, it actually, does it work for the door too? Let's see. Let's go back, leave vertex paint for object mode, go back to our structure, and let's create slot 2. So we know the main structure will be brick, but the door, maybe we'll try the painted material. Cubicity painted. Tab into edit mode with that face selected and assign that material. Yeah, that probably makes the most sense. Now let's focus on our brick material. So Blender does have a brick texture, procedural texture, which is ideal for this. So in the texture menu, Shift A is how we add new nodes. Might be a little late to be telling you that, but let's add a texture, brick texture. All right, I'm gonna put that, let's see, I'm gonna move these things around. Let's put our vertex color attribute there. And what texture coordinates are we going to use for the brick texture? Let's just see what brick does by itself. Shift Control click. We'll put that into a viewer node. And so you can see evidence of it being a brick material, even though most of it isn't looking like brick at all. We need to adjust the mapping coordinates. So let's duplicate our mapping node here and then hit the delete key or backspace key. I'm sorry, I've got a Mac keyboard and it says delete, but most keyboards are backspace because there's a different delete key next to the function. Anyway, it is the backspace key. We'll reset any node that's selected, and we're going to use the object coordinates in this case, and then plug that into our vector for the brick texture. Now, the object coordinates take into account the transforms of our object and the scale in particular. So wherever we use this material, we need to ensure that those objects have applied scale. But let me wait a minute because it's going to be easier to explain once we dial in the parameters a bit more so that our brick texture looks more like brick. So the main settings we need to adjust are rotation. As we adjust the X, you can see how that's rotating. Also, it's rotating according to our object's origin, okay, which we can't see here, I don't think. Yeah, I need to enable object origins in the shading workspace. So you can see our object origin is at the bottom, and that is the origin or the pivot point which we are rotating our texture coordinates. So we need to go either -90 or 90. It shouldn't matter. I'll go +90 just because, you know, nobody likes a negative Nancy. And now our brick texture looks great from the front, but not from the side. However, if we rotate in Y 45, that's going to split the difference. If we go all the way to 90, then it only looks good from the side, but by going in the middle, 45 degrees, now our brick texture looks good from all sides. But the scale is a bit large. If we bring back our human reference, these bricks would be more like cinder blocks. So I want to bring down the scale frequency right here. This value, the higher we take it, the smaller the bricks get. So I think something like that might be good. It's still a little bit big for real world scale. If you can imagine, you know, this human ref, the hand would be pretty small next to these bricks, but let's say something more like this is probably realistic, something like that. But that's not going to read quite as well for our simple stylized city. So I am going to make them a little bit bigger. I think I like the value of 7. Just to, you know, things get a little bit bigger. They're a little cuter, I suppose. And, you know, if you're a stickler for the fact that this is not how bricks are layered, on the corner especially, you can, you know, move the location in X, for example, to try and get, let's see, -0.145, -0.148. There. Sorry, I knew it'd be a really specific number, and it only works good on the one side. But if that bothers you, you shouldn't worry about it. We're never going to be this close. We do not need to be that OCD. So I'm just going to leave it cleanly at 0. I also don't care that the top of the door frame has these skewed lines. Again, You need to remember we're going to be looking at this from far away, so I'm not worried about that at all. Generally, it looks like a great brick texture, so we are going to go with it. Now, how we incorporate it, we're simply going to use another soft light mixture. So let's duplicate this, Shift D, and we're going to use our incoming color data and overlay our brick texture on top, because this brick texture has a great color variety where it's black in the mortar, as defined here in the color swatches. It's gray in color 2 and a white in color 1. So the gray and white kind of provide that variety in the bricks. And when we soft light that over top of our incoming color, we get an excellent modification of that color. So this is what it was before, and then this is how it is with the brick overlay, which is perfect. So if we wanted to change the color of this brick, it's going to work for any of our colors. And then after that, we still have the gradient, which, you know, applies that little bit of stylistic appeal where it's darker on the bottom, a little lighter on top. Let's turn that on and off. Excellent. And so that's good for color, but I also want to incorporate the brick texture as a bump map. All right, so we can take these values from the brick texture and add a vector bump node, and then take that color information, plug it into the height. You know, I like to draw a reroute node anytime I have two noodles coming out of the same socket. So shift, right click and drag over top of those. We'll combine them. I think that's just easier to read as I attempt to make this cleaner. It's very easy to end up with node spaghetti, which is, you know, not ideal. All right, so if we take our bump map and plug it into the normal socket, we should get this impression of our bricks being bumpy, except I'm not looking through our Principled BSDF. So Shift Control click on Principled BSDF. That Shift Control click is a Node Wrangler hotkey, by the way. And now it looks like our bricks are poking out. Of course, the closer we get, the less that illusion works, because it is just a mathematical illusion where we're manipulating the normals. But the further we get away from our object, the more intense that bump appears. So a strength of 1 is just too strong. Let's go to 0.5. The lower we go, you know, 0 is obviously no bump. I think 0.5 is going to be fine. Yeah, so it kind of has that texture on our brick walls. So that works out great. Now, the last area that I want to incorporate our brick texture is into the roughness. So currently, because we came from that concrete material, we have the noise texture, which is breaking up the specular. Believably, this is what a brick texture would do as well. So I'm just going to combine this with the brick texture itself using a color mix RGB node. So we'll take our brick texture, shift right click and drag to create a new reroute, and that will be slot 1, and we will overlay or soft light. Again, they kind of do the same thing, but soft light is more subtle, overlay is more intense. And, you know, while we're talking about that, hard light or linear light is the most intense. All right, so let's see how that affects our reflections. Clearly, we've got a very different effect. Now, remember that the roughness values, the lower we go, in other words, the more black we go, the shinier, the more mirror-like the reflection is. And so our brick texture has black mortar, which is perfect mirror finish, and that's why our material looks like really wet or glass-like in the mortar. So we really want to flip this around. We want the mortar to be mostly non-reflective or very unclear reflections, very blurry reflections. So I'm going to make a little more space and add a converter color ramp right before the overlay so that we can manipulate our colors. Essentially, we want to flip them around. Okay, so if we look at our brick texture and I flip these flags, or I just go to the down arrow, flip color ramp, now we've got the mortar being white, and the darker we go, the more shiny those bricks will become. So if we look at that, we're starting to get the effect that we're after, where as I orbit around, you see how some bricks kind of shimmer a little bit more than the others. That's really what I want, but I still think this is a little too shiny. You know, bricks are generally a little more matte. So I think an easy way to fix this will be changing the color ramp interpolation to B-spline, and that just really smooths out the color ramp. So the black kind of incorporates higher values by default, and that's going to work out fine. Still a little bit of that variety in the shimmer. I know that might seem subtle, but it is very, very helpful whenever you're rendering animations. Yeah, when it catches the light just like that on the front, small things go a long way. Let's turn off our overlays so we don't have any highlighting. Let's hide our human reference. And that looks like a pretty strong brick material. I like the roof material as well. Concrete is kind of making that look old while not, adding too much detail. Again, we're going to be mostly seeing this from above, so I'm really happy with the way this turned out. That is our first rooftop asset created. Let's create a few more. Let's continue with our rooftop assets by creating a skylight, which are apparently more common than uncommon, at least based on this photo. We have one here, 2, 3, 4, actually 6 on this building, 2 here, 1 here. So that should be an asset we get a lot of use out of, and it's pretty simple to create. Back in Blender, I think I'm going to use our human ref once again to duplicate. Let's jump over to our modeling workspace. I'll hide the roof access collection, and we will duplicate in object mode our human ref. So Shift D and then Alt G to move it back to the center of the world. I'm going to scale this in Y and Z. So I want it long in Y, and let's see, I'm trying to find a good length. That's probably pretty good. And this should also be pretty easy to scale per building once the asset is finished. But it's going to be basically a rectangle like this. Yeah, I think that'll be good. We can hide the, well, before I hide, let's rename this and move it to the proper collection. We'll call this skylight underscore CG cookie. Throw this into the standalone collection, hide our reference, and let's see, tab into edit mode. First, I want to make sure that our object scales are zeroed out, which they are not. So in object mode, Control A and apply the scale. Now our tools will behave as expected. Tab into edit mode, 3 to bring up our face selection, and I switched workspaces, so I need to disable screencast keys and then re-enable them. Okay, now we can see our hotkeys. And let's see, I think the way I'm going to start this is actually to get rid of this top face. Select the face and X, delete vertices. If I just delete faces, we're left with the rest of the box. But if I delete vertices, it leaves me with just the plane, which is what I actually want. So let's select that plane that's left, I to inset, because that's going to give me what I want. Perfect, a much smaller but proportional, skinny rectangle in the middle. And then I'm going to push that up, and that's going to be the base shape of our skylight. Now I need to cut a few extra edges that will represent the frame of our skylight. So Control R, and I'm going to cut one in the center. Now I'm not going to slide it one way or the other because you can see how it conforms to the skewed shape. So I'm going to right click so I don't slide, which means it's perfectly straight. And then Control B to bevel will keep, with the default settings, it will keep those other edges straight. Okay, so they're not conforming to either side. And so in the middle of that span, I will cut one more edge. All right, this should be enough. If you imagine our edges that we have here as being the frame, then everywhere in between all the faces will be windows. So I can select everything and hit Control B to bevel. All right, now I want to pull this out to be the width of our frame structure. So I think that's probably pretty good and thick enough right there. However, in our bevel options, I want to make sure that I increase the segments to 2 and the shape to 1. Okay, this will essentially keep our original shape and then split off 2 edges from our original edges. And that leaves us an excellent ability to select our internal faces, which will become windows. However, I do need an edge for the bottom. All right, so let's Control R and cut a new edge loop and slide it down just so that I roughly match the thickness that we established with our bevel. And then I'm going to cut another edge and slide it all the way down to the bottom. And the reason for that is I'm going to select the top set of verts, Control plus to grow my selection. And remember, there's 2 edges right here on the bottom. So if I hit plus once, that selects the last edge that we cut. And if I simply move that up, we're going to create some thickness at the bottom while leaving this edge flat on the ground plane. Okay, so now I have everything that I need to select our windows and extrude them inward. All right, so with those selected, let's hit the E key. I'm going to right click and use Alt S to push those in, just a little bit like that. All right, I want to enable offset even. Doesn't look like that changed anything, but generally that produces a better, more even extrusion. Not really sure why it's disabled by default, but anyway, now we've got our skylight modeled and we're ready to add material. So we'll switch back to the shading workspace, and I better reset the screencast keys. And while I still have our windows selected, if we turn on my overlays in edit mode, I might as well add color. So switch to vertex paint. It will create our vertex group, or our vertex colors. And I'm going to choose basically a white slightly towards the blue direction color like this, and then Shift K, which we can't see because we don't actually have materials. I never know which one to do first. Do I add my materials or do I change the vertex colors? I think this establishes that I should add materials first and then create vertex colors. So we should have the materials that we need. Let's add the painted material, which will be the frame structure. Add a new slot and use our glass emission material and assign that in edit mode. Assign. There we go. Now we can see that the glass is very reflective. And for our frame structure, tab into edit mode, Control I to invert the selection. And we will, in vertex paint, change that to be a dark, basically a black color. Shift K. Whoops, I need to enable selection masking, Shift K, and that looks pretty good as a skylight. I wonder if the window reflections need a little bit more. So we're at specular of 0.3. Let's go to 0.5. What if we mix in some metallic? 0.5 there too. That will definitely make it reflect more. And often, you know, windows kind of have this metallic-y, almost sunglasses-like reflection. So I think it makes sense to add a little bit of metallic here. Of course, we can always adjust that later, but I do like the more pronounced reflections. And that is going to be it for the skylight. Very, very simple asset to create. Oh, but I am forgetting something. So this is, I think, our only material that doesn't have the gradient component. So let's jump over to our painted material and grab all the nodes needed for that. Texture coordinate, mapping, gradient, and soft light mix. Control C to copy those. Jump back over to our window material and Control V, paste them. All right, so our vertex colors go into color slot 1 as a soft light into the base color. Let's see what that looks like now. Shift Control clicking on it. Let's turn it on and off. It's very, very subtle, but it is a little bit darker at the bottom. If we crank it up, you can see that a little more at play. Now, the soft light works less the closer you get to white. And so since our color is that white, it's not working quite as well. We could, I suppose, change the color to be a little deeper of a blue. Let's try that. So we'll go back to what we originally chose and then kind of take it down a bit. I still don't want it to be too saturated. Shift K, but that might be just what we need. That looks pretty good. That looks better. Okay, cool. Yeah, I think that's going to work out a little nicer, carrying through that lovely gradient theme. And now we can call this asset finished. Again, very simple to create. I love how quickly and easily we can build these assets, build up our library. Before you know it, we will have a ton of pieces to build our city with. So I have one more rooftop asset planned for this chapter. Let's build it. Let's build a water tower next, because they are also very common on city rooftops. They're essentially two parts. You've got the cylinder and the roof that contains the water, and then you've got the frame base at the bottom. Kind of simple shapes, but also some fun opportunity to add some flair. Let's jump over to Blender, and I think I'll keep the same approach of duplicating our human ref. so that we kind of start from a good scale point. And also our object will be flat on the ground. We'll go back to our modeling workspace for this. And I want to refresh the screencast keys. And into, let's see, my overlays, are they turned off? Okay, select the human ref, Shift-D to duplicate, and then Alt-G to move back to the center. Let's rename this to Water Tower _ CG Cookie. Throw that into our standalone collection. All right, and we can scale up. Let's see, how about S Shift Z to scale in X and Y, but not Z, so that we get an appropriate base size. Thinking something like that. Yeah, I think that looks good. And then Control A, apply our scale so that our tools work as expected. And then first thing I'll do in edit mode is bevel these corner edges. Control B, flatten them out. These will become the legs of our base. And then back to face select mode, select the top face, and then S to scale it down, give it a nice little taper. Although now that it's tapered, I feel like it's not overall big enough horizontally. So let's select everything, S, Shift Z, scale that back out just a touch. Okay, I think that looks good. And now on the top face, I will Shift D to duplicate it, right click so it doesn't move, and then let's scale it out a little bit more. E, and extrude that up to give it some thickness. This will be the platform that our cylinder sits on top of. Let's go back to the base here, because we can use this to both create our legs, but also the horizontal supports. And I just need to think about how I want to do this. I think what I'll do is duplicate these faces into their own mesh island. So Shift D, duplicate, right click so they don't move, and then E, and then right click so they don't, I keep the extrusion but I don't move it anywhere, and use Alt S to give it some thickness. Like that. And make sure we enable offset even. And there's going to be a little bit of a problem in that the bottom edges aren't flat on the ground. That's fine. We can just select them, use our 3D cursor as the origin, S, Z, and 0, and that will set them flat. Technically, we lose a little bit of thickness towards the bottom, but I don't think that's going to be perceivable. All right, and so we've got our legs established. Let's then select the interior shell, and I'm going to hit Control R and cut some new edges. It's actually going to be hard to cut these edges as long as the legs are visible. So let's Shift H to hide everything else, and then Control R, and I'm going to create 2 sets of edges, or 1. Let's just do 1 actually. So cut 1 new edge loop, Control B, and we're going to bevel that out. And essentially this will let us delete everything else to leave us with our support, Alt H to unhide. And I'm going to add a little bit of flair here, just a little bit of difference. If we slide this, let's see, I can actually do this symmetrically with the mirror modifier. Let's do that. Control L, and let's P to separate by selection, and then tab into edit mode there. What I did quickly was whenever you separate by selection, that dark orange means you have 2 objects selected, and the light orange is the active object. So even when you, if I undo to the point before separating and then hit P, separate by selection, it removes what I separated and puts it in its own object, which is not the active object. That's important. So to get that to be active, I tab back to object mode and just select what I separated. Tab back into edit mode. And I'm going to cut 2 edges right here, essentially to leave us with 1 corner of our object. All right, delete everything else. And from here, we can use the mirror modifier. By default, it mirrors on the x-axis. We get that side for free, and then we also get the y-axis for free. So what I want to do is just add a little bit of thickness where it approaches the corner. Nothing crazy, just sliding this up. There we go. Adding a little bit extra for fun, or just so it's not completely stupid simple. And we can also, since we're using modifiers, let's go ahead and add a solidify modifier to give us that thickness. We can enable even thickness here too. You can see slightly what that does. It just evens the thickness out. For whatever reason, it's not even whenever you use it by default. Just like the Alt-S tool in edit mode. All right, now we've got our base finished. Now we need a cylinder. All right, this is the first time we are breaking our cube theme, though it would just be weird if it's a square water tower. You know, we're not crazy dedicated to the cube stuff. A water tower needs to be cylindrical. That just makes sense. It would look very weird as a cube. So let's add in object mode, Shift A, add a mesh and cylinder. Now I think 32 verts is a little much. Well, actually maybe it's not. Usually it's too much whenever I use subdivision surface and I expect to smooth an object and with a modifier add more geometry. But for these assets, we're not going to use subdivision surface. So it actually does make sense to leave it at 32 verts. Sorry, that was just kind of thinking out loud. So we'll leave it here and let's scale down and let's set it on top. Let's see if I want to set it exactly on top. You know, we have our snapping to vertices enabled and I can hit GZ, hold control, and it will snap to the closest verts. Although I probably should have established the right scale first before snapping. So we want our cylinder to kind of fit inside of the platform. You know, since I'm scaling with our origin at the center, each time I scale it, you know, it loses our snapping. But I think that's going to work out well. And then for the top, we just need to extrude, right click, S to scale out, E to scale up, to extrude up, and then we're going to use the M key to merge at the center. All right. Give it a nice cone top. But this is a little simplified. I want to add some extruded rings for a little extra flair, like I said. So Control R. Oh, wait, we can't do that yet. Because I merged all these at the center, we no longer have clean quadded topology. Whenever you have a bunch of faces as quads, that is when the loop cut works. But it doesn't work when we have triangles. Now these are no longer quads, they're triangles. So I really need to undo and I guess slide this down first. Then I to inset, then E, and then merge at the center. All right, I just wanted to add that little bit of extra flair. Nice. And then I want to do the same thing down here, but I can cut edge loops, so it's going to be fine. Because if we look at our reference, it's very common to see that layered sort of effect. You can see all these horizontal lines going around. So that's what I'm trying to emulate. With them cut, I'm going to hit Control B to bevel them. You know, I don't want them to be too skinny, but big enough to see. And then E to extrude, right click to change any movement. Okay, let me explain why I right click. I know I do that very quickly and don't necessarily explain why. So if I hit E by itself, it will pick a face and then all of those faces are extruded along the normal of that face. But we don't want that here. So that's why I right click to cancel the movement even though it keeps the extrusion. And then Alt S will make a much better option for simply pushing those faces out into extruded rings. Excellent. Now, since it's a cylinder, I really don't like the faceting. It's supposed to appear round, even though this is a cube theme. This should be round, and I want it to appear smooth at the proper angle. And I think if we use the auto smooth of the normals, then it should work out fine. So let's right click, shade smooth, and then enable auto smooth. Okay, yeah. So our 90-degree angles are still sharp, but the roundness of the cylinder as a whole appears round. So that is going to work great for the model. All that's left to do now is add materials. We'll jump back over to the shading workspace. I can hide my human ref. It's done its job. And let's see. Since I have multiple objects, I need to create a collection. In Standalone, let's call it, we'll just copy the name from Water Tower CG Cookie. And let's call it Water Tower dash base, Water Tower cylinder. Put those into that collection. Wait a minute, what is this cylinder? What did I just rename? Must have renamed the wrong thing. Oh, that's right. So this is using, I have 3 pieces. I forgot that. All right, water tower frame support. And the only reason I'm not combining it with this, oh, I could. I could totally do that. Or I could leave them as separate objects. Either way is fine. If I wanted to combine them, because, you know, combining means less objects, a little cleaner, I'll show you how we can do that. Let's see. Essentially, I just need to kind of cut it at the corner again, right? So let's delete everything but the corner. And then here, what I'm going to do is extrude in X, snap it here. Let's fill that. Fill above, fill below. I want to get rid of the interior faces. X, delete faces. All right, now that's ready for the mirror modifier if I just combine it here. All right. So this is nice because if I ever want to edit this, I only have to worry about the one side or the one corner, and everything else is done for free. So now we've got the frame. We can just call it the base, tower base. Okay, the cylinder, water tower, cylinder. Okay, so now we can add our materials. Let's think about what we already have. You know, for the base, I wonder if we need a metal material. I think we probably do. Let's start from the painted. I'll duplicate this and call it metal. And the only difference really is we want to turn off specular and turn on metallic all the way up. All right, let's look at this in material preview. Okay, so a metal with a color of black, which is what the current vertex color is, won't reflect anything. So I need to jump into vertex paint, and now it's reflecting like chrome. But I want it to be fairly dark. Shift K. Yeah, that's going to work out fine. So the difference with metallic is that it's reflections that are incorporating the color to the reflections. Like if you think of copper, that is reflecting, but it's got an orangish reddish hue to the reflections. Gold has a yellow hue. Chrome has no hue. So that's the difference between metallic and specular, in that they're just 2 different types of reflections. But obviously metallic is going to make it feel metallic. I think I went a little bit too dark perhaps. Yeah, I think that's going to be fine. Though let me swap it out. I'm curious if the concrete material might work best. Yeah, that actually might work better. Even though brand new, this thing is probably made of metal. Over the years being on a rooftop, it's probably going to be pretty dirty and pretty, you know, worn looking. So I'm going to leave that as concrete. Though I'm going to keep the metallic because we will be using that soon. I just created it a little bit prematurely. Since I don't have it assigned to anything, here's a quick note. It has that 0 in front of it, which means 0 users. If I save the file and close Blender, it will be deleted. So it needs to have a user. If it doesn't have an actual user, you can create a fake user with this button right here. So now if we look, it has that F. So it'll just be there whenever we need to use it. But, you know, stylistically, I do think probably concrete works best. Maybe for the entire water tower, honestly. Let's go to, let's select the next object up here and change its vertex colors. Let's see, if we look at our reference. All right, so there's a bit of a variety. This one at least is yellow. This one's chrome. It looks like a grayish color, and then kind of an orangish cone top is kind of the way to go. So let's apply that. We'll go with this kind of darker gray, maybe slightly towards the reddish orange direction, maybe implying a little bit of rust. Shift K. Wait, am I on the wrong? No? Okay. Oh, it doesn't have a material applied. Let's add the concrete material. All right, so that's good for the base. Now let's apply at the top. Select the top vert, Control plus to select the roof, I guess, of the water tower, and vertex paint. Let's change that. Let's just switch our color slot, use this brown and make it a little bit lighter, a little less saturated. Whoops. Enable selection masking. There we go. And that's going to be it for our water tower. So I love this project because you can create things so quickly, reusing the materials. You know, we're starting to develop a very modular, reusable workflow, and that is the fun of projects like this. So still plenty more to build though.